So there are a couple of metallic areas on this biker that I want to cover, and because they are so prominent, especially near the engine block and the main body of the bike, I decided to mix up the metallic tones I use just to create a bit more variation. And so the silver that I use, for example, on these dark panels is a little darker than the silver I'm going to use on the exhausts and on the wheels, things like the nuts and bolts here or on the ammo feeds. And then similarly, I've got two different tones of gold. So something a little brighter that I'm going to be using on things like these skulls and ornaments, and then something a little more dull on the engine or exhaust casing. So I'm going to walk you through how I do these different metallics, and they're fairly straightforward. They all revolve around the same 5 colors, and then a couple of different contrast paints. So for the silvers, we're primarily using Scale Colors Black Metal and Scale Colors Heavy Metal. Depending on how bright we want to take the metals, for example, in the chrome of the exhaust, we are going to introduce a bit of Vallejo Air Chrome for our highlights. For the golds, we're going to be using Scale Colors Negro Gold and Elven Gold. And then we mix in a bit of Air Chrome for the highlights, or we mix in some of the heavy metal to dull it down, and I'll show you exactly where I do those steps. And then for the contrast paints, you're going to need Cygor Brown, Goregrunta Fur, and then a bit of Pterodon Turquoise, and then some Lahmian Medium to help thin it down. It's important that you have Lahmian Medium and not just water. Water interacts differently with these washes than they would regular acrylic paints, and they cause them to behave a little differently and to apply a little less smoothly than if you were to dilute with Lahmian Medium. So I highly recommend picking up a lot of this to go with your contrast paints. You're also going to need some Vallejo Black to darken some of the metallics. So the first thing we're going to start with is painting these dark panels, and they're actually probably the most straightforward. All it is a 50-50 mix of black and black metal. We base coat that on in 2 or 3 thin coats to make sure it coats consistently. We'll do a wash or two on this panel with a contrast paint just to add a bit more color, and then we'll highlight it with our heavy metal. And it's important that we do a couple of thin coats. You want the base coat to be very even and very smooth. The scale colors, when you dilute them, have a tendency, or the scale colors when you dilute and when you mix them with other colors, have a tendency to dry a little patchy or a little spotty. And so you just want to do a few thin coats to ensure that the coverage is nice and smooth. So the next step that we're going to do is we're going to highlight this metal. And to do that, we're going to be using our heavy metal from Scale Color. And we're just going to focus on the edges and then creating some weathering and some scratches by just painting in these marks, scuffs, and lines. To also help simulate some wear and tear on the edges, we're not going to do a clean, smooth edge highlight, but we're going to make it a little uneven and kind of rough and pockmarked to help carry that illusion of damage and weathering. So we're just going to highlight all around the edges of these panels and then adding in these scratches and marks just randomly along the surface. And with our chip and edge highlights done, we're just going to go back in with a contrast paint, just to add a bit of a wash sort of to nuance the texture a bit. We're going to keep this fairly diluted. We're going to mix a 50-50 mix of the Goregrunta Fur, Cygor Brown, and then we're going to dilute with our Lamia medium, and then we're just going to do a glaze. Now, because we don't want the color to be too heavy, or at least I don't want the color to be too heavy, I'm only using a little bit of contrast, and I will be using a lot of the medium to dilute. You can play with the ratios and use less medium or more of the contrast paint if you want a heavier, dirtier color. And so we're just going to glaze this wash, and I'm really only going to focus it on sort of the bottom where it would collect. And I'm not really concerned about making it super perfectly smooth. I'm kind of thinking that these are sort of like grease and dirt and oil marks, and they're not going to dry super evenly on the surface anyways, so that bit of patchiness in the color helps to sell the effect and add a bit more of a textural detail to the surface. And then you don't need to do this last step if you don't want to. I'm going to go back in with an oil wash to add just a little bit of definition in these deepest recesses and crevices. You can also use Nuln Oil for this, but depending on how neatly you've painted your base coat, you might not even need this step entirely at all. So I have this black oil wash pre-prepared in advance because I use it very, very often. And it's a 50-50 mix of a dark brown and black, and then that's mixed 50-50 with mineral spirits. And all we're going to do is we're just going to dab it into the recesses and let the capillary action of the oil wash just pull the paint in. Okay, and that's the dark panel done. So the next area of metallics that we're going to cover is the brighter silver and chrome. Now you can see it on the foot pedal here, on the exhaust tubing, and then I use it on other elements like the center of the hubcaps, some of the joins or hydraulics of the bike. I'll end up using this for things like the bolter barrels, the ammo casings, things like that. And the core principle is pretty much the same, and I just vary the ratios or the highlights depending on how dark or bright I want the color. So all of this brighter silver starts with a base coat of black metal. We're going to do 2 or 3 thin coats of this to ensure a nice even coverage. And then we're going to highlight up with heavy metal. And then we're going to do final edge highlights with Vallejo Air Chrome. For something like the exhaust, obviously, because I want it brighter, I want it to be more chrome-like, I push it higher with the heavy metal highlights, and then I go really strong with the air chrome. Whereas something like the hubcap, I might be only adding a few spot highlights with heavy metal, and then just a couple of focused highlights with chrome, so that the entire thing isn't too shiny. Really, it all just depends on the overall look and finish that you want. But because the colors are the same and they're very flexible, you can adjust, pull back your highlights by adding a bit more heavy metal just to cover it up. So we're going to start with a base coat of heavy metal. Now, much like when we were painting our dark lines, how neat or messy you are at this stage will determine how much cleanup you end up having to do and whether you need to do a Nuln Oil or black oil wash to help redefine some of these crevices and shadows. So I'm going to be as neat as possible. I'm going to try and maintain the black join between these different rings, and in general just be as neat as possible so that I am minimizing the correcting time or time I have to spend correcting afterwards. Now that we've base coated our black metal, we're going to start highlighting by mixing in heavy metal first in 50-50 ratio, and then applying pure heavy metal. Now, I'm only really going to be focusing on highlighting the exhaust because that's sort of the bright or the silver that I want to be the brightest. For things like the foot pedal or some of the internal piping here, I don't want it to be as bright. I want sort of that difference in terms of color and texture between the two. So you can see that all I've really done on the foot pedal is done some edge highlighting with the heavy metal. Whereas on the exhaust, I've gone very, very heavy with my highlighting. I've created this band or this transition between this line of pretty much air chrome in the center through heavy metal through to black metal on the bottom. So for something like the foot pedal, all we're simply doing is we're doing edge highlighting of our heavy metal, and that's pretty much it. We're going to add a couple of lines to simulate scratches and some of the weathering. But a darker metallic, I guess a darker metallic look is what I'm aiming to achieve on a segment like this. And so by keeping my highlights minimal and focused, I'm letting the scale black metal do all the work, all the heavy lifting, and it is quite a dark metallic tone, so that's good. It's also helpful or useful to keep in mind, because I am painting this model in sub-assemblies, where the different parts end up being. So for example, in this model, his right leg sits positioned like this. And so I spent a little more time applying some highlights and painting these portions right here. On this model, his leg and foot sit planted on the foot pedal. And so all of this ends up being hidden and in shadow. So I'm not going to bother highlighting any of that. So when painting something cylindrical like this exhaust, we have to keep in mind that metallic objects, cylindrical metallic objects, tend to reflect highlights in sort of these bands of color. And these bands of highlights tend to run along and follow the shape of the object. So in this instance, I'm just going to very, very heavily paint this on. I'm just taking my heavy metal. We're going to get our highlight in a line like this. And then it'll continue on these rings like so. And then to really, really sell the effect of a polished reflective chrome, we're going to do a second line just underneath it, leaving a gap in between the two of them. As the pipes blend and weld together, it'll probably fade off right there. And then we'll have another one just down here. Okay. And then, of course, once we go back in with our Air Chrome, we're going to focus on the center of those. But before we get to that step, we want to sort of smooth this out. So we're going to take our black metal, heavy metal, mix it in a 50-50 ratio, and we're just going to glaze pretty much in between the transitions. once we're happy with the transition of our highlights, we're then going to go back in with our Air Chrome, and we're just going to start focusing some very, very bright spots. Primarily on these bends that do stick out. Right here where the weld joins. And then right here as well where the pipe bends out. And then with that strong highlight right here and right here, we're just going to carry that over into these rings. We're then going to take Air Chrome and we're just going to add some edge highlights to these rings. So you can see with my highlights done, I was a little messy and I got some paint into the crevices where these rings join the pipe. So once again, I'm just going to go back in with my trusty black oil wash and I'm just going to redefine those lines. You can also go back in and paint this by hand. You can use Nuln Oil, you can use diluted black paint. It's up to you. I'm just going with what's easy for me and it's nice and quick. So once again, we're just picking a point, we're dabbing the paintbrush in when it's loaded with some of our oil wash, and the capillary action will pull the paint and the pigment along the crevice. It's going to clean up some of these areas on the foot pedal as well. The advantage of using an oil wash, it's actually very quick and easy. You can see how simple it was to redefine that line. However, it is an oil paint, so this will take a few minutes to dry, probably about a half hour. So we're just going to set that aside and then return to add a bit more color with our contrast paint. So you can see here, just to add a little bit of color and a bit of sort of this oil greasy look, I've added a bit of a brown color. faded into the exhaust where it joins the rings, and then on the back here as well on the ends of the exhaust. And to do this, we're going to be using a contrast paint heavily diluted with lame medium. So we're going to take some Cygor Brown and lame medium, and then we're just going to glaze it in, focusing on, again, where those crevices join. So I'm going to start with a fair bit of medium, probably 3 or 4 parts to 1 part contrast. And we're just going to lightly glaze it in and push that color in. Now you'll want to work quickly and confidently with this contrast. Don't push it around too much, because you'll end up pulling some of that paint off, and it will end up leaving spots and patches where you've picked up that color. My recommendation is to apply a pass with your contrast mix, let it dry, and then if you want it heavier, apply another pass, or if you want to fix up some of these problem areas, go back in with your metallic paints, your heavy metal, your black metal, and just lightly touch it up. You can dilute your metallic paint just a bit. It'll knock back its strength, and then you can sort of use it as a glaze to correct and create a better fade. Much like the contrast wash we did on the darker metallic panels, I'm okay with the color here not being perfectly smooth, because I want to simulate sort of grease and just the natural weathering in use. It being a little rougher and patchier actually helps to sell that effect. And then I'm going to go a little heavier on the bottom with a 50-50 mix of contrast and medium. And we're just going to concentrate some intense color on the bottoms of these pipes where the oil and grease would collect. And that's the silver and or chrome done. Now, once again, I paint all the silvers on the rest of this model, or I will be painting the silvers on the rest of this model the same way. I just vary how much heavy metal and chrome I apply depending on how bright or dark I want the metallics to look. So on something like the exhaust again, where I wanted it brighter, I went very heavy with my heavy metal and air chrome highlights down the center. But something simple like the foot pedal, it's mostly just heavy metal with some edge highlights. Sorry, it's mostly black metal with some highlights of heavy metal. So there's 2 different gold segments or gold parts that I want to cover, and I'm going to cover them separately just so we don't get confused when we're going back and forth. The first is the richer or the deeper gold that I'm going to do on elements like these ornaments on the armor panel. And then there's the more diffused gold that I do on the casing of the exhaust. So we're going to start with the ornament, and then we're going to go with the exhaust. So we're going to start by base coating the ornament with our Negro Gold. Much like the black metal, you're going to have to apply 2 or 3 thin coats of this color to get a nice even base coat. With our base coat done, it's now time to shade this metal. Now to do this, we're going to be mixing a 50-50 mix of Goregrunta Fur with our Negro Gold. Now what this is going to do is it's going to keep that metallic color. It's going to give it a stronger application in terms of consistency as compared to the contrast by itself. And we're also going to end up warming up the gold by mixing in this contrast. And I found that this is, for me, better than just using the contrast straight up because I can more readily apply it like a glaze when it's diluted, and I don't have to work as quickly as I would if I was just using pure contrast. Of course, the issue I have with the contrast paint is the more you push it around, the more it pulls and creates. It's like a pulling or a marking effect where you're pushing pigment, but you're also removing it, and it doesn't apply as evenly as I would like. So with this 50-50 mix, we're going to start applying some shadowing to the skull. So focusing on the bottom right here where the brow ridge is, the bottom of this ring. And then all of these rays actually have 2 parts. There's a top and a bottom half where they angle differently. So there's a crease down the center. If I can show you. So if you imagine that's the center ring, each of those rays is a triangle, yes, but it's got a raised line down the center. And both of these, if you look at it from profile, face different ways. So if my light source is coming from here, for example, this panel is receiving light and this is not. So this will be in shadow. And you're going to have to, or at least what I'm doing is I'm tackling each triangle, considering which panel or which facing is looking towards my light source and which is facing away. Okay, so it'll end up being something like this. So what that means for me is I now have to take my contrast and metal wash, and depending on which ray I'm painting, I'm going to be either shading the top or the bottom. Now you can be a little messy or a little rough at this stage because we're going to be going back with our Negro Gold to refine our highlights, and then we're going to be highlighting up. So if you're a little messier with the shadow stage, that's okay. We're just looking to add a bit of tone, a bit of color. Okay. We're then going to do another shadow using Pterodon Turquoise. And we're going to be focusing this on the side that's opposite of where my light source is going to be, and only in specific spots. Now the goal of this is to cool down the shadow a bit and add a little bit of extra color nuance and depth to the gold to separate it from something like the exhaust. So you can see on this model, on this side, there's a bit of a greenish blue tinge here in the shadows. And then on these rays on the lower portion. They might be a little harder to see because they're smaller, but trust me, they're there. I didn't focus on the rays up here because they're more directly facing the light and they're going to be a little brighter. So for this, we're just going to use pure contrast and we're just going to use the lightest touch. Now, once again, if you're a little messier at this stage, that's fine. We are going to be highlighting back on top of this, and so any overpaints, we're just going to end up correcting. We're going to take our Negro Gold and we're going to just touch up and refine some of the parts that we may have overshaded with our contrast mix. So mainly on the top of the skull over here, I'm going to start refining the eye socket and the brow, the bridge of the nose, the teeth, and then the highlighted portion of, or the highlighted side of these rays. The next step is to do our second highlight, and we're using Elven Gold. And once again, we're just continuing to refine our highlights on the top of the skull, on the side that's facing our sunlight or our source of light. The top of the brow, the bridge of the nose, the eye socket, and then the top quarter of the ring, as well as some of these rays. And then my final highlight is going to be a mix of this Elven Gold and Vallejo Air Chrome. And I'm going to be very sparing with this because I don't want the air chrome to overpower the gold. I want it to really focus only on some of the spot highlights and maintain that the warmer gold tone throughout. So I'm going to dot the center of the brow where it furrows, the bridge of the nose, and then the bottom where it'll catch just a touch, bottom of the eye socket where it'll catch. Spot top of the skull, and then this line running down the side. The rays closest towards the light source will get highlighting, and then I'm just going to highlight the edge of this ring, and then the opposite edge on the inside. Couple of dots for the rivets. And the skull is done. To paint the gold on the exhaust is kind of a similar process, only we don't use Pterodon turquoise. We use a bit more Cygor brown, and we actually mix in a bit of heavy metal in some of our highlighting steps to dilute the or to knock back the color. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to do a base coat of Negro Gold, and we're just going to base coat the entire casing. So when we're highlighting the exhaust casing, because it is a combination of flat and cylindrical surfaces, we're not going to do a straight bright to dark highlight like you would on like an armor panel. We're going to combine what we know about reflective surfaces and how they highlight and shadow, sort of reflecting the environment in bands. And we're going to apply that to create a bit more detail, or I guess texture, in the on the surface of the object. So if you actually look at this finished exhaust here, I've actually got a brighter band up top along this line, or this ridge where it curves. It's shadow here. I've got a bit of a shadow band right here, running right beneath this highlighted portion. I bring it to a highlight over here, not quite as bright as up here, but still highlighted, or I maintain a highlight there, into a deep shadow here, which carries through. The way I'm going to apply this highlight and shadowing is a combination of my black metal Negro Gold mix. We're going to use a bit of Elven Gold with black metal mixed in. We're going to use our Cygor Brown for this deeper shadow here and a touch of this here. We're going to warm up this portion with Goregrunta Fur. And then we're going to do edge highlights with Elven Gold, and then Elven Gold mixed with Vallejo Air Chrome for the scratches. So we're going to start by mixing black metal with our Negro Gold. And then we're just going to focus a band of highlight on this top curve right here. We're going to add a touch of this highlight to the sides as well, just to help carry some of that tone through. Our next highlight is going to be a mix of the Elven Gold with black metal. Again, we're doing about a 50-50 mix. And then we're going to highlight along the center of this first highlight pass that we did. And bonus points, you can follow along with the highlight that you've done on the exhaust and carry that highlight line through. We do a bit of feathering to help smooth out the transitions. And then I'm going to mix in a bit more Elven Gold just along the center to really brighten it up. To help create this warmer highlight band down here, we're going to take our black Negro Gold and Elven Gold. We're going to mix them in a little bit of a 50-50 mix. And then we're just going to create a very soft band down here. The approximate height of this, I'm just going to follow along with the highlight of the lower exhaust. And you can see that it's really creating these this band of a colder highlight up top and then a warmer highlight on the bottom with a nice transition in between. What we're going to do now is we're going to get some Cygor Brown and we're going to dilute it with Lamy and Medium, and we're going to create the two bands of dark highlights, or dark shadows, sorry. One right here, which will be more diluted with Lamy and Medium, and then one down here, which will be more heavy on the Cygor Brown side. And all we're looking to do is, much like the gold on the skull, we're just looking to glaze this color in. And so I'm just going to paint a line and then pull the color in either direction to create a bit of a soft fade. Now, depending on how heavy you are in the application, you might have to do a couple of passes, but that's okay. This will help us build up the color. We can slowly tweak how dark we end up wanting this band of shadow to look. And then the more passes we do, and as we're glazing it out, it helps to create a smoother transition. We're going to get a little heavier with our Cygor Brown near the bottom. And I'm just bouncing back and forth between the other side just to double check, try and mirror what I've done. Once you're happy with that, if you want, you can go back in with some of your previous colors, so like your Negro Gold or your Elven Gold, and just refine or touch up some of these transition spots. You may find if your contrast paint dried or set a little heavier in some spots than you want, just a couple glazes of this metallic will help to knock it back and smooth out those transitions. So our next step is to edge highlight every surface, every edge of this casing with Elven Gold, mixed with a little bit of Air Chrome. And much like when we were edge highlighting the darker panels along the main body of the bike, to help simulate some of the weathering and wear and tear on the casing, I'm not going to create perfectly smooth highlights along the edges. I'm going to create some dots and some scrapes to just simulate some of that battle damage. It makes it look like the surface is uneven and it's catching more or less amounts of light depending on how imperfect the surface is. Now, the reason why I am highlighting every edge and not just the, I guess the bottoms that would catch the light, because metal is reflective, all these edges are going to catch reflected light and ambient light from the environment around. And so we're highlighting with a medium color or a medium tone all around to simulate that reflected light and that ambient light. And then we're going to follow it up with a focused air chrome only on certain spots that will actually be our direct highlights. So something like these exhaust venting ports, for example, using our Elven Gold air chrome mix, we're just going to highlight all the way around. We're now going to follow up this highlight with a final highlight of air chrome. We're going to be focusing on the raised edges that would catch the direct light. We're also going to focus some of the highlights along this band of highlight we've done here to help reinforce this highlight a little bit over here. Again, to reinforce that highlight. And then we're going to add some surface scratches and chips, just some subtle detail to make it look like it's been battle damage and has wear and tear. We're going to dot the rivets. So along the edges, we're just picking out some of these top corners. A little bit on the back there. And then where we have this band of light going across, we're going to focus on this edge right here. And then on the bottom of this ring, because our light's coming from on top. Bottom of the ring. And then a bit where our banding is. And then because our banding catches the tops of these three ports, we're just going to add a touch on the edge right here. Using a fine brush, we're just painting some scratches. More to start random, wherever you feel like you want to have some. that's the gold complete.